Dawn in Eagle Red Canyon doesn't announce itself. It arrives the way old things arrive here. A slow taking of breath, a light that lifts like dust from a shoulder and leaves the shape of objects soft at the edges. The canyon held its own weather, a draft that moved like a hand through a long grass, a sound that was almost a word if you stood very still. People said the canyon kept things, bones, broken pots, the echo of a hoof. It kept names too if you listened hard enough. That morning the canyon held a whisper. Ezequiel Ward was awake before the light, as he often was. He had a way of listening that came with years alone. The townless hours had taught him to read the small changes, a stone that didn't shift, the low complaint of a mare, a raven's direction. He sat on the low ridge above the wash and wrapped his hands around a tin cup, the coffee inside thin and black as river water. The cup smelled of ground beans and the camp smoke he had banked against the cold. His fingers were stained by the leather of old saddles and the maps he'd folded and refolded until the crease had the patience of habit. He had a small house of his own carved into the rock, a single room, a lamp, a bed with a narrow blanket, a shelf of books and curiosities from places he'd passed. He kept his things few and precise. He had once kept other things, medals, a folded flag, but the canyon took weight as neatly as it took sound. What remained was a man who had learned to look away and keep his place. The years riding the lines between settlements and the wilderness had left him blunt in speech and soft in his judgments, as if life had filed his edges down until only a careful moral center remained. When he heard the whisper, it was like a note out of place. A human breath caught under the sandstone song of wind and stone. He knew, before he saw anything, that something had fallen into the canyon the night before. Ezequiel descended the narrow path with the cautious balance of a man who had survived other people's panic and the slow weathering of time. The canyon opened a new way of seeing with each step. Light pooled in a small bowl of sand, a scatter of juniper needles held like rusted pins, the scent of iron somewhere beneath the dust. He moved along the rock face where the shadows still held their nights cool until he found her. She was a shape under a slab of stone, a small human tilt against the canyon's vast indifference. A shelf had broken free and come down across the narrow cleft, pinning her shoulder and the curve of her hip. Her dark hair lay like a mat over her jaw. Her fingers, pale from the dust, gripped at nothing. The sunlight that had already come through the high rift struck her cheekbone, gilding it softly. For a moment, Ezequiel simply knelt and listened to the small noises her body made. The rasp of breath, the tiny bird sound that escaped with each inhale. "Hold," he said, not because she could hear him, but because he wanted to set a word steady in the air. He felt for her pulse, slow and ragged beneath the sand grit. Her chest rode with the wind. She was too warm in one place and too cold in another, as if the world could not decide which had claim. He worked the slab with patient hands. He had hauled rope over cliffs. He had steadied crates when horses shied. He set a loop under the edge of the stone and took a brace against the lip of the drift. The rock yielded with a dull protest and a sound like a breath leaving. When he rolled it away, the canyon seemed for a second to sigh. She blinked in that slow, animal way of someone woken abruptly. Her eyes were the color of river stones, dark with a light that didn't belong to the open plains. She did not cry out. When she spoke, it was nothing like a plea, and nothing like the gasps he'd heard in battle encampments. It was small, measured. "Thank you," she said in English with an accent shaped by places he had not walked. "You're hurt," he said. He turned her so she did not lie sprawling on the hard place. He took a cloth from his saddle, dampened it at the little spring he had nearby, and set it to the cut along her side. She flinched once, then steadied as he worked. He could smell smoke on her hair, a memory of burned grain and cedar. The canyon kept memory like that, as if the dust itself preserved the day a thing happened. "What's your name?" Ezequiel asked, because names gave shape. "Nahira." The name was a soft thing, and the canyon kept the sound in its hollows. She said nothing after. Her hands flexed in the sand, as if feeling for the shape of something lost. He had seen that look before. Not the exact lines, never the same face, but the way a person held themselves when they'd been sent through fire and still breathed. It was a look that had once belonged to many faces in the far campaigns he had rode in his youth. Men who'd returned from places meant to be forgotten, and who carried a silence heavy as a shroud. "Can you walk?" he asked. He wanted the answer to be yes. He wanted to know she could stand under her own weight and find a path out of the canyon without needing him. Maybe out of some old self-preservation, he wanted the right to walk away afterward. She pushed herself up by the elbow. Pain flared at the edge of her mouth, and she swallowed it without saying. "I can try," she said. Her voice was a low thread, and as she found her feet, she favored the bad side. Ezequiel steadied her with an arm across her waist, his palm braced to the small of her back. They moved in silence toward his shelter as the day pushed into itself. Inside his small room, he made room the way a man who knew the value of space made room. He dragged up a blanket from the foot of the bed and set it where the light fell brightest, arranged a tin cup of water near her head, and lit a lamp that threw a circle of yellow into the dim. He tore a strip from his own shirt and bound it with practiced hands around Nahira's shoulder. She watched him with a careful attentiveness that was not precisely fear. It was an assessment. "You were under that slab how long?" he asked when the simple tasks were done and the lamp guttered. "All night." She said the last word as if offering it to the canyon itself. You could see she listened behind her eyes. "They came in the dark. Smoke, men with guns. We ran." He remembered his own hands steadying a rifle years before, the smell of cordite and the way commands sounded like knives. He remembered turning away from things he didn't want to write on himself. He had left people in the field because there were orders, and because there was always another place to go, another line to hold. He had learned to close his mouth against the harsher truths. "Did they follow you here?" he asked. He kept the question flat. "Did they know this canyon?" She shook her head. For a moment she was someone else in the way she held her breath, and the canyon kept the echo. "They burn and go," Nahira said. "They don't look for names. They look for the smoke to tell the other men it is safe to come." Ezekiel's mouth tightened. There was a half-truth there. Men looking for a shape to throw blame upon, a body to point at, a rumor to make stick. He did not ask the question he might have asked once. Why? The canyon would not answer that. Things happened for reasons that were not simple. When she slept, it was fitful and careful. Ezekiel watched her with a guard he had kept for years for strangers and for himself. He had a way of listening that in the past had saved him from bad ground and double-crossing. Now it hung between them as an unspoken contract. He fed her thin broths and dried jerky, set a cup of coffee at the chair where she might wake and want to taste the bitterness of the world. She asked few questions about him. When she did, they were precise. "You live alone?" she asked as twilight folded the canyon into a softer shade. "A long time," he said. He could have told her the small, plain truth that he had been a soldier, a trailman, a fence against two eras. The words lined up in his throat like a story half told. He told a half. "I keep to the canyon. It makes sense." "And yet," she said, letting the line hang between them, "you came when I called." He could not remember answering the call as an act of bravery. He had moved because the sound of breath under rock broke something in him, because a whisper had become a thing he could not ignore. He had been a man who once looked away. He had the memory of other people's dying, the way the world organizes itself to make those deaths invisible. He did not like the man he had been who could walk past. "You can stay a night," he said, "at least until you can ride?" Her look when he said that was a flicker of something complex. Relief was there, but something like caution sat along the edges. "I will not be a burden," she said. "You are not," he told her, though the word meant little in the canyon's calculus. No one here is expected to carry more than they can. They slept at opposite ends of the room, two shapes that did not become company by proximity alone. In the night, a wind came down the wash, carrying with it the scent of distant wood smoke and the sound of a mouth breathing the canyon's long language. Nahira rose in the dark and stood at the small window that opened to the rift. She pressed her hand to the stone and let the cold press back. Her eyes traced the silhouette of the land where the world had broken. For a moment she moved as if the rock itself had voice, and the canyon held what she said. Ezekiel had not slept well. He had the sleep of a man who had known watch and was not used to letting his guard fall. He walked to the window and found her looking at the line where townlights sometimes gathered far off. "You hear it?" he asked. He had not thought he would use the fragile term out loud. Nahira turned her head, and the cellar of her throat made a small sound like the brushing of leaves. "The wind says a path," she said. It says they are coming. He watched her. The uncertain light made the planes of her face hard. What do you want to do? He asked. It was an honest question, and the weight of it hung in the room like the lamp smoke. This was the question that would decide whether a man remained a bystander or stood in the open. Nahira folded her hands and looked at the pattern of her palms, as if reading shapes. For a moment she spoke of things he did not know how to weigh. I have been hidden, she said quietly. Hidden becomes a prison sometimes. If they come for a body, I will not hand them one. Ezekiel's response was a grunt that could have meant agreement or the settling of a thought. He had spent his life balancing what he owed the world and what the world owed him. Standing between a rumor and a human being was an odd calculus he had not often chosen. When the morning broke, they heard the first true signs that the world outside their sandstone bowl had turned toward them. Far away, beyond the ridgeline that cradled the town, a rider cut the horizon. The shadow he cast at first might have been a man alone with orders. Then another followed, then another. Ezekiel set his hand to the rough plank of his door as the hooves came nearer. He smelled the change on the air. Not the canyon smoke, but the sharper, metallic tang of a rumor turning into intent. By midday, the town had a new note in its normal life. Silas Crow rode in at the head of a small column, his hat low and his coat buttoned, his face a map of angles and a jaw that seemed designed to hold little mercy. He was a man who believed in the clarity of force. People made space for him as if a storm were approaching and they needed a place to stand. Ezekiel rode down into town to see what the new man had come to do. The streets were thin with noonlight and thick with gossip. Word moved like a fast animal. A woman had been seen in the canyon. A stranger with Europe's hair and the stench of smoke. She might be a threat or a beggar or both. Silas's mouth added what rumor needed. Order, he said loudly as men gathered in the shade of the mercantile, and hands litched toward belt loops and whatever tools men used to make order in the hills. Sheriff Thomas Riddle watched from the stoop of his office with a kind of pulled face. He was a man who wanted the job to be clean in its lines. He wanted law to be more ledger than gut. He had the look of a man who had not decided whether the ledger would bend to the town or the town would bend to the ledger. We need to know more, he told the crowd, but his voice had the small tremor of someone attempting to steady a wavering line. The town needed a reason to move. Silas supplied it with a grunt and a surety. The canyon harbors things, he said. People are unset. If there's a rumor, it makes sense to look. Rumor is a kind of hunger. It feeds quickly on the shapes it cannot fill, and in a town that had room only for one story at a time, hunger was quick to swallow nuance. They gathered the men who had been out of work, the ones with loose debts and sharper edges, and they took them to the saddling post as if they were a pack moving toward the scent of an old kill. Some carried lanterns. Others carried the bright certainty of group thought, that when a man's voice grows loud enough, the town becomes safer when it moves as one. Ezekiel stood at the edge of town and watched them. He had the advantage of knowing the canyon's moods, but he had the typical disadvantage of a man who had learned how to avoid entanglement. He thought of times he'd turned away. He thought of nights when survival had demanded such a practice. He tried to imagine what the men who would ride into his canyon had been taught to think of a woman like Nahira. Symbols can be made of people, and once a body is a symbol, it is easier for a crowd to find reason for violence in the name of safety. He returned to his house not long after. Nahira sat by the window and wrapped a thin blanket around her knees. She did not ask about the men or their number. She seemed to listen to the canyon the way a musician listens to an instrument. They will come because they are scared, she said, as if making a map of the facts for herself. Fear makes men follow other men's footsteps. Does fear make people cruel? Ezekiel asked. He kept the question surgical. It makes them loud, she said. When they are loud, they forget to look at what sits in front of them. He thought of the quiet of the nights he had spent in camps where orders were given and bodies moved like mech. He had seen what loudness did. It turned complexity into single-line art. The canyon had no patience for art reduced to a single line. They did not speak of the village she had left. When she did manage to place a few words about it, they were thin as a whispered prayer. Fire. Men who did not know names. They took smoke and left open land. Her gaze sometimes traveled like someone reading a map for pieces that no longer fit together. "I have been walking for days," she said once, and the sentence contained more than trail distance. Ezekiel kept watch. He stationed a lantern in the alcove outside his door, and when the evening had fully folded, he built a stove fire that threw longer light. He sat with his back to the stone and his eyes toward the path to town. The men from the town rode dusk out in a small band with lanterns and knives. Their silhouettes were sharp against the sky like a church of black nails. They moved with the kind of certainty that breeds in crowds when a leader supplies a single story to explain every fear. Silas Crow's voice cut through the usual noises as they rode past the wash. It was not a large voice, but it had the hardness of someone who'd decided his lines and set himself to them. "We've a right to make sure the canyon doesn't harbor trouble," he said. A man near him spat and laughed, and the sound was more fear than humor. "We keep law here." Sheriff Rydell watched from the doorway of the sheriff's office with a hand on the pillar, his face a single field of possible judgment. He had not yet chosen where the law's weight would fall. He counted heads, turned pages, tried to find a reason to tie his duty to common sense rather than to a man's will. "We need to be careful," he said at last, voice thin. "We need to ask questions." Silas made a sharp sound through his teeth. He was not a patient man for questions. Questions take time. He looked up to the ridge where Ezekiel's lamp burned like a small star. "If there's a woman out there who brings trouble, better we find her before trouble finds us." Nahira listened to their words through the stone like a person eavesdropping on distant thunder. Her fingers found a groove in the window frame and she traced it the way someone might trace the path of a remembered footfall. The canyon breathed around her. She had a way of seeing the wind's language that a person born to the land sometimes carried. The scent of horses, the slight change of temperature, the way dust lifted from the far trail like a note. "They are sharpening their voices," she said to Ezekiel. "When men sharpen their voices, it means they are looking for a sound to cut." "What do you want to do?" he asked her again, perhaps because both of them needed to hear an answer that might give moral shape to the days ahead. She chewed the inside of her cheek and looked at the single cup of coffee he had poured and left to cool on the table. "I have run enough," she said. "I will not hide, not like a thing to be found. If they want a body, then let them ask for one." Ezekiel understood the courage of that answer. He also understood the cost of it. The canyon had a way of reducing choice to heavy bills. For him the choice was an old one, to stand and become part of someone else's story, or to step back and keep the peace that comes from living unentangled. He thought, not for the first time, of his own history of turning his face from certain horrors because he had concluded he could not hold all the weight. He tasted an old regret and found that it had a slow and insistent bite. "Then we'll meet them together," he said at last. The words surprised him by their steady sound. "If they come to talk, we talk. If they come to take, we will see." She looked at him in a way that could have been gratitude or a new assessment. "You are not given to words you cannot bear," she said. "No," he answered, "not anymore." They set a few measures that evening with the small, careful acts of people preparing for trouble. He moved a handful of jars to the back of the shelf to be ready for the trip. He tightened the saddle that had belonged to a horse long since gone. He made a clean bandage and tucked it into his coat pocket. Nahira packed too, but with the light touch of someone who had little left. She gathered a small bundle of things that tasted like memory. A carved piece of wood, a cloth with a faint red thread, a small shell she had found near a river once, and held them like a promise. When the wind shifted at twilight, it carried toward them a new sound, not the solitary hoofbeats of a passing rider, but the deeper murmur of men in numbers, the clink of bits, and the shadow that a group casts across the land. Nahira set her bundle down and walked to the threshold with a calm that was not devoid of readiness. She could have climbed higher into the rocks and made a better hiding place. She had chosen not to. Ezekiel stood with the lamp in his hand and looked at the men as they assembled beyond the rim. Silas Crow was easy to spot. His coat caught the last light, and his shadow swam across the wash toward the canyon's mouth. He had a gait that suggested he believed the world could be aligned by the simple act of walking in front of it. Around him was a small congregation of town men drawn by rumor and the promise of being on the right side of whatever would happen next. "Easy!" the sheriff shouted when the crowd looked toward the canyon. "We have no warrant. We have reason to ask questions." "There is reason to take care," Silas said, as if he had found a way to stand law and fear in the same sentence. He folded his arms like a man pinning a flag against the wind. "If there's trouble in that canyon, we'll bring it out and make it civil." Nahira stepped forward to the rim so that the last of the light caught her face. It was a small motion, but it held the weight of one who had come through smoke and survived. She did not hide. She made herself visible, not because she sought confrontation, but because she refused to be a shape passed between men's mouths. Ezekiel felt the small, exacting pull of that moment, to hide and risk being captured without voice, or to stand and risk whatever came with the light. For the first time in a long while, he felt the canyon answer not with silence, but with an active sound, as if the stone itself had chosen to place a small echo under his ribcage and push him forward. "Who are you?" Silas called. His voice had the sharpness of a man who expected names to be convenient things. "Nahira," she said. The single syllable landed in the void between them and the men who had come. There was a rustle among the crowd, the soft intake of breath that prefaces judgment. "She is one woman," Ezekiel said, stepping into the mouth of the shelter that had been his refuge for years. The lamp in his hand trembled a little, not from fear, but from the long use of muscle. He positioned himself so that the men saw a human being and not merely a dark aperture. "She is not trouble on a rope." Silas's jaw tightened. He circled as a man might circle a problem he intended to draw neat lines around. "We have reports," he said, "and reports are the currency of men who would fold facts into suitcases and take them away. That this woman is not from our town, that a smoke was seen, that people wonder." "Rumors are cheap," Ezekiel said. His voice was plain and carried the steady weight of someone who had done hard things without yelling about them. He knew that once something was labeled rumor, a man could either feed it or starve it. He chose the latter. The sheriff stepped forward between them, the thin man of law who had the look of someone balancing on a wrought line. "We will ask questions," he said. "We will speak civil." "Questions," Silas spat. "We don't have time for questions if there's trouble in the canyon. The town comes first." Nahira watched them all as if measuring them by some private yardstick. "You call yourselves town first," she said finally, "but you come to make fear louder. You think the land will make your truth simple." Her words were quiet, and they are the kind of words that have the habit of making a crowd's temper shift. They put substance where there had been only noise. A ripple passed through the men like a wind over a field. Some voices grew hard at the edges. Some looked at their boots. Others looked at the man beside them and nodded as if agreeing to something unsaid. Ezekiel felt the canyon in a new way then, as if the land had taken the whisper he'd heard that morning and set it like a test in front of him. The question of the title, whether the cowboy would hear the whisper, was no longer a matter of simple sound. It had grown into a choice that would mark him in ways he had not expected. He could tell himself he had a duty only to his own doorstep. He could say he had no appetite for confrontation. He could argue that survival demanded a careful avoidance of useless blood. All those things were true in certain contexts, but the canyon kept a ledger he could not easily balance. The whisper he had heard at dawn had become a voice. To pretend it was not his to answer was to erase the very thing that had woken him. "Stay," he told Nahira in a voice that was both an order and an invitation. It was a small act of shelter, the sort of thing that makes up a life if repeated often. If they'll demand to talk, we talk. If they'll demand more, we decide what to do then. She nodded once. She did not ask for guarantees. There were none on offer. The canyon did not give guarantees any more than it gave easy exits. It simply offered whatever small shelter could be found in its folds. The town's men shifted. Lanterns scratched small circles of light into the dusk. The sheriff hesitated. Silas did not, and where one man is a determined blade, others follow because a man who is loud supplies the moral shape they desire. The sun fell a little farther behind the ridgeline. The canyon held its breath. If you are drawn to slow, character-driven westerns like this one, please take a moment to like and subscribe. There are more stories that listen for the quiet things. Night in Eagle Red was a different kind of listening. The stars leaned down like scattered nails, and the canyon kept the shapes of every small sound. Ezekiel stood by the door with his lamp snuffed, the new darkness making men together look like one solid mass. He kept his hand near a knife, not because he wanted to use it, but because a man learns the gesture of self-protection early and holds to it out of habit. Nahira sat with her bundle in her lap and watched the shadow of the men pool at the mouth of the canyon. "They come in numbers," she said. "Numbers are good at forgetting to look." "Numbers are loud," Ezequiel replied. "They are also afraid." "Then they will find someone to blame," she said. "And you will have to choose if you will keep the blame or hand it away." Everything in the canyon held the day's dust. The wind had a memory of horses and burnt roofs, small things to a man who had not never lived through such loss. She told him. A small line slipped into the dark. "I have names in my head that the canyon keeps. They are small things. I will not give them to a place that will burn them again." For a long time they watched the dim shapes, and between them words were small and measured. The light moved across the wall and the moon washed the dust in silver. The men at the edge of town tightened their huddled confidence and pulled their wraps up against the night. Lanterns shifted. The sheriff's presence was a thin defense against chaos. He spoke to the crowd in measured tones, trying to slow the man-made wind. "We go to ask, we do not take," he insisted, because words of law have a habit of making some people feel safer, though they carry little muscle. Silas's lips compressed. The man had a way of taking offense at patience. "If they hide what they should show us," he said, "then we will make them show." That was the kind of line that clicks in certain minds. If you define truth as something that can be pried from a body by force, you begin by believing force is a necessary instrument of truth. Ezequiel felt the press of the moment like a weight that either he would lift or it would crush the small shelter he had made. He had not chosen public gestures for decades. He remembered the last time he'd stood for someone in such a way. The memory had not cleaned itself of cost. He had a sense of the ledger the canyon kept, and the way the town liked marks clear. But the whisper he had heard that morning had been a small, insistent thing. He had listened. Listening, in his experience, often demanded action. "All this for one woman," one of the men muttered. "We are better than letting trouble grow." "Better than looking the other way," another answered. Voices matched and made the shape they'd chosen. "Better than what?" Ezequiel asked aloud, because sometimes the plainness of a question breaks the small resentments that grow in the dark. The men looked up, some for surprise, some for irritation. Silence carried for a stretch like a long river. "Better than letting things fester," Silas said. "We keep the town safe." "You keep it small," Ezequiel said, meaning it as an observation more than a challenge. "You think safety is what fits in your hands. But there are things bigger than a single town's ledger. There's blood, there's memory, there's the sound people make when the world has chosen sides." It was a brief thing, a small exchange in the canyon's dark, but words like fishhooks caught where they could. The leader in the crowd did not like the way a man's language had started to demand accountability of his group. He moved closer. "You are a resident," Silas said, with the condescension of a man secure in his narrative. "Why does a stranger have shelter with you?" "Because she was trapped under a stone this morning," Ezequiel said. "That's reason enough for a man to offer shelter." "Perhaps if she were from one of us, the town would not—" A laugh, rough with the easy cruelty of imagined differences, cut off as the sheriff's gaze pinned them. The sheriff's hand tremored in its pocket where some law might have been kept. He was uneasy with the path this held. Nahira rose and walked to the very line where the light spilled into the night, her shadow stretched like an invitation. She spoke slowly, each syllable deliberate. "I came to the canyon because it keeps names," she said. "If a place can keep names, then perhaps it keeps echoes. I did not come so you could make my echo into a weapon." Silas's laugh was short. "Nice words for a woman who might have caused trouble in 3 towns over." "Where I come from, we do not ask trouble to be polite about coming," she said. Her voice shaped itself differently now, less the stripped response and more a small blade. "You have made my place a story. I refuse to be your story." The crowd shifted again. It is remarkable how quickly a group will adjust its anger on the basis of a new detail. Some men moved back, suddenly uncertain. Others found the new threat delicious, the added drama giving them permission to sharpen. The sheriff tried to keep the voice of order clear, but his words had the brittleness of a man whose ledger was not thick enough to contain the day's shifts. Ezekiel stepped forward. He placed himself where he could be seen, his lamp guttering in the wind. "You come to make an example of a person," he said. "You will not find order by making someone's life smaller." Silas scowled as if the word had struck a bruise. "You'll not decide for us," he said. "This town will decide its safety." "Then let the town decide with eyes open," Ezekiel replied, "not with the easy work of rumor." For a long minute the canyon held the space like a thing straining. Men exchanged looks. The wind carried the small staccato of a distant horse. The ledger remained unpaid. Choices had been set before them, a path of quiet, of negotiation, or a path of force. The first of the men to move was not Silas. It was one of those who found himself easily persuaded by the drum of many voices. A lantern flickered as a figure shifted forward, drawn by an impulse old as groups. For those who like the way a crowd can make a single voice into a chorus, the move was easy. They stepped toward the line of the threshold, and the canyon seemed on the verge of being a classroom for violence or a place where a different resolution might be found. Ezekiel did not like that. He knew the physics of a push and the way that small acts precipitate bigger ones. He also knew that once a person surrendered themselves to the idea of being symbolic rather than human, the rest follows like a chain of worn links. He thought again of the whisper he'd heard at dawn, the single voice under a slab that had demanded rescue. It was ridiculous to say so, but the whisper had made a claim on him. To act, to bear witness, to stand in an otherwise unlit presence. He had listened and answered. The question now was whether the canyon and the men around it would let that answer count for anything. As the first figure moved forward, Ezekiel caught Nahira's glance. It had a steadiness that crested and then fell. She did not plead. She did not ask for a martyr's recognition. She simply stood there as if the shape of her being could force men to look at the human before them, and not at the rumor wrapped around her like an old coat. Ezekiel planted his feet and felt the rock beneath him as if it were a beating heart. The lamp's light trembled in the night's air. The men looked like small birds, their moral clarity a temporary thing. The wind made the canyon sing faintly, the whisper he'd heard earlier threading through the larger sounds like a small ribbon. He reached for nothing more than the integrity of the action he had already begun, to make his house a haven for a moment, and to ask the town to answer with its better parts rather than its fear. The choice he was making was the kind that had no trumpet. It would not make a man famous in the town's books. It might, however, keep one human life from being parceled into a cautionary tale. The first figure halted a pace from the doorway. Behind him, Silas Crow's shadow lengthened. The sheriff's voice tried again, small and official, to stave off an inevitable friction. The lanterns made islands of light and cast long, accusing shadows. Ezekiel looked at Nahira and saw the canyon in her face, the way the land had put itself into her bones, into the smoothness of her hands. He felt the whisper, that small early morning sound, fold itself into a question he could no longer ignore. Would he hear it and do the small hard thing of standing in its path? Or would he let the weight of old habits tilt him toward staying out of a danger that was not his? He made his decision in the silence that came before the storm of action. The canyon answered by holding every small sound, as if willing to record the choice for its own archives. The first of the men stepped back, uncertain now, while another moved forward, and the night tightened like a noose around a throat. Lantern light painted them all in an uncertain gold. They had not yet drawn knives. They had not yet lifted hands. But the moment was a hinge, and the hinge was groaning. Ezekiel's jaw set. He had heard the whisper. He had answered it. He had heard the whisper. He had answered it. For a handful of breaths, the canyon kept the two parties facing each other like two halves of a thought. Lantern light made the men at the rim look as if they were carved from the same wood. Their faces lost detail and gained the conviction of mobs. Behind them, town roofs muttered with watchful houses. The wind moved through the wash and carried the smell of horses and old rope. Silas Crow stepped closer until the light cut the planes of his face in a way that made his jaw look sharper than it actually was. He wore certainty like a second skin, and certainty pressed forward easily into other men's certainties. "You stand in front of a story you did not author, Ward," he said. His voice had that habitual low cut that made things seem already decided. "I stand in front of a person," Ezekiel answered, keeping his hands loose and readable. not stories, not rumors, not flags. He did not like the list of names men put on other men to make them smaller. The sheriff shuffled his feet on the threshold of the town, the small man feeling what it was to be the thin paper between the flame and the house. "We ask," Thomas Rydell said. "We ask who and why." He tried to keep his words even, the way a man keeps a ledger. The ledger, however, had been written upon by other hands before anyone noticed. Silas's gaze slid to Nahira, who remained where she'd come to stand, not behind Ezekiel's shadow or at an animal's skirt, but fully visible in the lane of lamplight. "Who are you in their mouths?" Silas asked, as though being named by others might explain her and make her less uncomfortable. "Are you trouble? Are you a band? Are you a thief?" Nahira's response was quiet, but not small. "I am Nahira," she said. The name had more steadiness in the second syllable now that it had been said twice. "I have walked. I have lost things. I will not be made into a warning." A man near Silas spat onto the rock. "Warnings are good," he muttered. "They keep the young ones from wandering." "They keep the comfortable safe," Nahira answered, her voice carrying a calm that had been hammered on long nights. "They make the frightened feel brave." Silas bristled like a struck animal. "Take her in, Ward," he said, gesturing as if the command could be folded into a neat action. "Let the town see what she holds. If she's a threat, we remove it. If she's nothing, we leave. Either way, we do not harbor potential ruin." Ezekiel's lamp bobbed in his hand. The little flare of flame looked foolishly vulnerable against the group gathered at the canyon's mouth. He felt the canyon under his boots, cool stone, sand, 100 small points of history, and it steadied him like an argument that does not need repeating. "Under my roof, I keep people from being made into stories for strangers to use," he said. "I will not hand her over to a rumor." "You will?" Silas said. "Or you'll make trouble for this town." There it was, the old explanation men used to permit what they'd not sustain alone. Protect the town by offering violence in the name of safety. It was a tidy loop. No one had to feel the weight if it could be made communal. Sheriff Rydell's shoulders tightened, and for a moment he looked as if the ledger might crack under his fingers. "We do not need more blood," he said. "We go in and ask. If there's evidence, we act within law." "Law takes time," Silas pressed. "Action does not." Under the crowd's breath, a ripple moved. Rumor quickened. A man on the fringe, drunk with the courage of numbers, let out a bark of something that was meant to be a joke and instead landed like a stone. A lantern trembled. The canyon's throat seemed ready to close on any small spark. Ezekiel stepped forward so that he stood in the direct line between Nahira and the men. He placed the lamp down at his feet and rested a hand on the doorpost that had held him through smaller storms. The action was quiet and old-fashioned, a man putting himself in the way of harm because harm had once walked on his watch and left him with the residue of regret. "If you want questions asked," he said, "then ask them. Ask them like men. Do not turn the night into a trial by fear." Silas's face darkened. He walked around the lamp to circle Ezekiel as if he were a problem that could be examined from every angle. "You have been on the land long enough to know when something's wrong," he said, voice low. "You could be part of the problem." Ezekiel felt a small, primitive clarity like the press of a steel edge. "I'm part of what answer is to be," he said. "And tonight, that answer is this. You ask or you leave. No taking without reason." Silas's laugh was short and hard. "Does the law mean so little to you?" he asked. "The law's a word," Ezekiel said. "This is a human being." Another man, younger and less sure, shifted and reached for the lantern by the sheriff's hand. Someone else murmured, "We can't let strangers be the law," as if this were not precisely what law had always been called to do, to restrain the loud demands of men and care for the quiet rights of those without voices. Nahira watched without pleading. Her eyes gathered the faces like one reads a map, counting lines that might be safe to step upon. She had been in places that taught the art of listening, not to be placated, but to find the tune beneath the shout. Behind her, Ezekiel's steady presence flicked the collective compass. Silas moved like a man tired of words. He was the kind of man who regarded negotiation as an irritation. "If you won't give her up," he said at last, the words like an ultimatum, "then we'll take her by force. We do it for the town." The phrase cut the air. There are phrases that teach men what they may do. This one wrapped itself around a few and loosened the knot of restraint. A lantern swung, a boot shifted, a voice in the crowd, the one who had laughed before, made a step forward like a tide. The sheriff lunged between him and the doorway, his arm snatching for the man's collar. "No," he said, and his single syllable held a thinness that might have been courage or dread. "No, you'll not." The man cursed and pushed the sheriff aside with the casual brutality of someone practiced in roughness. He lunged, and the moment opened like a well-aimed trap. Ezequiel stepped faster. He did not draw a weapon. He moved the way a man moves when he has to close a small distance and take a thing by the cuff before it becomes a greater thing. Hands met hands. The moment should have been ugly and decisive. Instead, it convulsed with the messiness of men who had little practice in carefulness. A man fell backward, lantern clattering. The light splintered into small points. The group swore at one another. A horse startled and threw its head. Silas cursed and drew his pistol by the habit of quick violence rather than for necessity. Ezekiel's eyes took the motion and saw consequence ride level with it. "Put that down," he said, more an order than a plea. Silas's fingers closed on the gun. He did not yet lift it. He wanted the threat to be visible. That visibility bought him followers. "Either she comes out calm," he said, "or we take her." Nahira stepped forward then, not to meet a bullet, not to be heroic, but because she preferred visibility to being an uncounted thing. She moved in such a way that no one could easily pretend she had been hiding. She stood in the lane of the last lantern light and faced the men who had been shouting about order and safety. "If you want to take me," she said, and the utterance was leveled like a small, steady tool, "then take me with a reason, not a rumor." Silas's face tightened as if a rough truth had been held up to the light. "You leave us no choice," he said. The edge in his voice deepened. The young man who had tried to charge earlier snarled as if at a provocation. He raised a pistol hastily learned in other towns. He was not as steady as Silas. His aim was a tremulous thing. The barrel flipped up and a shot rang out. It was not aimed at Nahira. It wasn't aimed at Ezekiel. It clipped the belly of a mule tied behind Ezekiel's shelter, a warm beast that had given him years of service and the odd company of a creature that did not ask for explanations. The sound was too close to the ears and too quick into the night. The mule collapsed with a small, stoppable sound. It did not cry as men imagine an animal might. It folded like a thing that had been counted and paid. The canyon took the fall with a new kind of recording. Dust rose in a coffee bloom and settled onto the animal's flank. For a second all sound stopped because the fall had made space where words had been, and the space told the story in a way yelling never had. Silas's mouth opened and shut. The younger man swore and dropped his pistol. A few in the crowd laughed like small children startled into the wrong game. Someone cursed. Someone begged silence. Sheriff Rydell moved through them with the awkward hands of a man who had to keep the ledger from tearing. "By God," he said, "we needed no blood." Ezekiel walked forward and knelt by the mule. He did not look at the men. He looked at the animal, and the place where a bullet had turned a life into a task. His fingers found the mule's flank and felt the small, stubborn heat. The animal's eyes were wide and patient, without the arithmetic of men. Ezekiel felt a rage that was not practiced into someone else's language. He had no desire for a duel. He had, however, an inclination to grief that would harden into something quieter than revenge. "That was not necessary," Nahira said, voice a low, patient thing. Often people mistook quiet for weakness. In her case, quiet held a sharpness like a well-kept blade. "You give yourselves permission to harm what you cannot explain." Silas shrugged as though the animal were expendable ledger. "Sometimes the town must be reminded," he said. His eyes skittered over Ezekiel and found not the man he wanted. There was no immediate, easy crack to lever him out of place. Ezekiel's jaw set. He stood slowly, not to be theatrical but because the situation required him. "You will leave?" he said. "You'll leave tonight. You will go back to your town, and you will sleep in your beds, and you will tell yourselves you kept order. You will leave now." The sheriff pushed his hat back and looked as if he were trying to rub sleep out of his own decisions. He was a small man caught in the larger weather. "They'll not go easily," he said. "There are men who need to be satisfied." You take what you like and call it satisfaction, Nahira said, and satisfaction is often another name for a wound. There was a long silence. Men measured their courage against the mule's stillness and found it wanting. For the first time, some of the louder voices in the crowd looked at their hands and understood their hands might have to do more than point. For a few, the idea was intolerable. For others, it was curiously inconvenient. A man who had been leaning against a post spat and muttered about cowardice. He was answered by the real possibility that if blood spilled that night, the town would wake to have to account for more than rumor. Silas looked as if he might drag the moment into venom. He stepped back and then forward, gauging. Ezequiel did not jerk away from his posture. There was a steadiness in his face now that had the effect of a low, honest weather. "We will take no person," he said, and his voice took the shape of a promise, not grand, not sanctified, but a plain deed. "Not tonight." "Is that your law?" Silas asked. The question was rhetorical and meant as a challenge. "It's my house," Ezequiel said, "not a courthouse." The sheriff took a breath and then another and let the room of his middle ground show. "Then the town will withdraw," he said, "until we can have a proper convening. We will not—" His voice faltered and then steadied. "We will not risk a massacre." Silas paced in place as if the retreat offended him, and in a final show of contempt, he spat into the dust. "One day," he said, "the town will remember this. The town will not forget those who gave comfort to strangers." "You'll remember what you choose to," Ezequiel replied. "You may even be right by your own ledger, but tonight there's no taking, not without proof." The men mulled and shuffled. Some were relieved to find a reason to go home. Others muttered about slights. The sheriff's thin authority, however, did enough, just enough, to allow a face-saving withdrawal. Lanterns bobbed and men jostled. Silas turned his horse as if the cliff of dignity had not been grazed. He rode off with half his followers in a motion that was less of honor than of exhaustion. The rest lingered, angry but unable to shape that anger into anything sustainable without sacrificing more than they were ready to lose. As they left, some threw sharp words over their shoulders, promises not to forget, threats of justice that sounded like weather warnings for the next harvest. Silas, who had the gift of leaving a place as if he had all the rights already written down, rode with a face that claimed the field had been conceded only grudgingly. When the last lantern moved into the break of the road, the canyon exhaled. The stones seemed to settle back into place around Ezequiel's small shelter, and a quiet that was not unmarked returned. The mule lay there, warm and still. Ezequiel sat by the animal for a long time, the lamp making small golden circles in the sand. Nahira came and sat beside him without speaking. Her presence was comfort without the claims of explanation. "You could have done more," Nahira said finally, not as accusation but as observation. "What more?" Ezequiel asked. He had expected the question and braced for the moral arithmetic that often followed such events. "Left," she said. "Hidden deeper. Let them find nothing to feed on. Run until there is no map left for them." Ezequiel's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Leaving is easy," he said. "It keeps the ledger clean at the cost of the unnamed." "And standing is costly," she said. "Yes." His voice was a slow confession. "I have ledgered those choices before." They sat together in a quiet that was shared rather than explained. The canyon had a way of keeping the possibility of other nights in its ribs. There would be consequences. Silas would not forget, and the town would continue to render verdicts out of rumor. But for that night, the choice had been made. Ezequiel had heard the whisper and given it a place to speak. They buried the mule under the wash the next morning, in a shallow hollow where stone had been kind. Ezequiel did the work with the economy of a man used to tending small deaths, a respectful process no more. Nahira carried a small flat stone and set it modestly at the head of the earth. He used a rough tool to mark the top. She traced the line of his hands as if reading a map of a stranger's care. At dawn the canyon tasted of coffee in the copper of dust. They made a small fire in a shallow ring and boiled water, the steam rising like a little surrendered thing. Nahira watched the motion of the cup in his hands, how he moved it to his lips, and how he waited for her to take her fill. The rituals of shared food were the smallest tokens of something like trust. "You can go," Ezequiel said at last, half as a test and half because part of him wanted to hear the answer. He had not known the shape of his duty until now. Keep a place for voice until voice could be heard. I could, she answered. But what I want is not to flee until a new fear has been invented for me. I want a place to rest while I decide what to do next. Ezekiel's hand closed around the tin cup until the knuckles shone a pale white. You can stay, not forever perhaps. The canyon is honest that way. It gives what it has for a time and asks for patience in return. Nahira nodded. Her eyes moved to the far ridge where town lights had been, and to the line of dirt road that cut the world into what was safe and what was not. I will not stay because I have nowhere else, she said. I will stay because there is now a man who heard what the canyon said and acted on it. His mouth made a small sound that could have been pride or embarrassment or the relief of a man who finds a small redemption that is unadorned. The days that followed were not peaceful in the sense of being untroubled. Word drifted in fits. Men from neighboring places asked questions. Silas kept his own counsel and watched like a predator that understood patience as a longer blade. Sheriff Rydell came by a few times with his official gait. He apologized in the way small men apologize when they need to repair a version of themselves that has been exposed to weather. He brought news of the town's talk and of the simple fact that memory is elastic and crowds forget what is inconvenient. Ezekiel and Nahira did what fragile people do. They repaired small things. They mended a sailcloth that would make a tent. They set snares for a rabbit. They traded stories in unconventional terms. Nahira speaking of the way wind reads a valley, and names which were more private than most would know. Ezekiel speaking of the worn edges of an old life and confessing finally the weight of the things he had let be. He did not make excuses. He spoke in the direct sentences of someone who has learned confession as a plain accounting. We are both walking from places, Nahira said once as they sat on a low rock watching the evening flatten into coolness. The canyon keeps what's dropped. It keeps old fires like small bones. And sometimes it keeps chance, Ezekiel said. He had found he liked the work of arranging words into small, orderly truths. And sometimes men listen. She looked at him with the small maker's steadiness she reserved for things she wanted to know to be true. You listened, she said. I did, he answered, and it cost me a mule. She smiled, not particularly amused, but touched by the plainness of the payment. Small cost, then, for you. He felt the old habit of diminishing himself rise. Not small, it was a good mule. It carried me through worse ground. Then mourn it, she said simply. Mourn for what matters. But also, her voice softened into a counsel he had not expected. Do not let sorrow keep you from building. Building what? He asked. A life not measured by what you did not do. A shelter that is not only for those who resemble you, she said. Shelter for people who need one for a season. The canyon offered no promises. The land simply accepts and keeps with the neutrality of stone. Yet among its folds small things happen. A friend makes a shelter. A woman chooses to stay. A man hears a whisper and does not turn away. That was not a miracle in the grand sense. It was the small miracle of human continuation. Sheriff Rydell visited the canyon more often as time went on. He came with a small jar of sugar, or with news that the town had agreed to moderate its searches. He had been bruised by the way the affair had exposed the weaknesses of lines he liked to draw. He was a man who could not easily decide what courage best suited him, but he was learning that the ledger of law might sometimes be bent toward the quiet thing. Silas's shadow remained in the edges. He made 1 or 2 showings, riding by the rim as if to remind the canyon that he observed the world and had not been defeated. The town would gossip and then drop it like a smoldering brand when other excitements came along to distract. Rumor finds new bodies to feed on, debts, saloons, harvests. Nahira's presence became a line in the town's private ledger, a thing too complex for simple judgment. One morning, weeks after the shooting of the mule, they found a small green sprout pushing through a narrow crack in the rock near the threshold of Ezekiel's shelter. It was a single blade, stubborn and bright against the gray, like a needle of refusal. Nahira sat by it and smiled the way a person smiles when small stubbornness triumphs over the inevitability of weather. It will be trampled, Ezekiel said, or washed, or eaten. Then we watch over it, Nahira said. Watch is a kind of mercy. They kept watch. In the afternoons, they worked on small repairs and on clearing a path that would make the canyon less forbidding to people who might come with honest questions rather than hunted motives. Nahira taught him a way of reading a gull's flight. He showed her the places where the rock kept warmth for the winter. They shared the small appliances of everydayness, the measuring of coffee, the folding of cloth, the tending of a fire. Those things built not a promise but a possibility. People came, some asked for water and left, others asked for directions and carried gossip. A traveler lingered on the rim and learned the name of Nahira and said it as if trying it on, testing how it fitted. The town's talk softened under the practicalities of neighbors' lives. The harder textures of Silas's hard words dulled like iron in rain. Nothing was erased. Memory kept accounts. But a small shift had been made, measured and stubborn like the green sprout in the rock. There were nights, in the small hours when the canyon let sleep be a thin thing, that Ezekiel would wake and stand at his window and listen. The canyon had changed under him, moved at least in the small registers of sound. The whisper he heard once had become not merely a single line, but a network of small signals. The rasp of Nahira's breath as she mended some cloth, the soft ticking of a lamp as he read, the far-off clink of a horse's shoe where a ranch hand rode an earlier path. These were not the thunderous noises of history. They were the manageable daily sounds of people abiding. Once, as the sky eased into dawn and the color of the land made gentler things possible, Nahira came to the doorway with 2 cups and set one beside him. "You listen like a man with hollows," she said, not unkind. "You fill them by staying." "I thought staying was the coward's way," he admitted, surprising himself with the confession. "It can be," she said, "and it can be resistance. It depends on what you do once you stay." He held the cup in his hands and felt the heat bleed into his palms. The taste of coffee had settled into their days like a small ritual. He thought of the mule, of the shot, of the raw currency of his choice. He thought of the whisper and how fragile a thing it had been in the morning light. He looked at Nahira and found she had not been made into a symbol in his mind at all, but a person with the brittle, stubborn courage of someone who had walked through smoke and kept some parts of herself intact. "Did you hear it?" he asked her, the question from the title of Nights and Stories. He did not say whisper, preferring to name what had been asked without dressing it up. "I heard it," she said simply, "and then you answered." "And if I'd kept to my old habits?" he asked. "Then the canyon would have kept another long thing, another name that needed shelter," she said. "You would have built a ledger inside yourself that weighs more than you can carry." He let the cup rest against his lips and found there was a calm that was not empty but full of the small furnace of life. "I would not have slept easy," he admitted. "Nor did you," she said. "It taught you something." "I taught myself nothing," he countered. "You taught me." She shook her head slightly as if disappointed by him taking the credit. "We teach and we learn together sometimes. It is the way of the world." When the light fully took the canyon, the sprout in the crack leaned into it like any other small life. Ezekiel bowed his head for a moment, a small motion of gratitude that needed no more naming. He had not rescued a village or toppled a tyrant. He had done something smaller and, to his mind now, more exacting. He had heard and answered a whisper that otherwise might have been lost. The days would come when others would test them. Men like Silas keep looking for cracks to fit their rigid tools, but the price for small courage is not the absence of cost, it is the willingness to pay it again when the next whisper comes. Ezekiel knew that. Nahira, who had walked through fire and kept the names of those she loved within her head, also knew it. The canyon kept their joint decisions the way it keeps bones and broken pots, quietly, without jubilation, but with a permanence that mattered more than rumor. At the mouth of the canyon, life resumed its slow trade with days and nights. The town continued its routines, some people grudgingly kinder, some still prone to the old ease of turning fear outward. Sheriff Rydell grew steadier, perhaps because the experience had opened some worn places in him. Silas's movements grew more circumspect as the months made a record that was less ignoble than he'd guessed. For the men who had ridden with him, the story had been just another night. For the town, it would be a line in a bigger ledger. For Ezequiel and Nahira, it became the small spine of a life they might build together for a while, no more, no less. When the sun rose one morning and painted the canyon walls in the copper light that tasted like old coins, Nahira and Ezequiel stood at the small green sprout and watched it lift. "Will it grow?" Ezequiel asked. "It will take what it can," Nahira said. "And if we do the rest, if we watch and feed and keep it safe, maybe one day we find that a crack in the stone is not so small anymore." He placed a small stone at the sprout's base as if making an offering. The action was practical more than symbolic, a guard, a marker, yet it also said plainly that two people had chosen to keep something alive that rumor had nearly sealed. They did not promise forever. They did not promise no more hurt or the end of men like Silas. But they had chosen, in the canyon that keeps things, to answer a whisper with an act that would not go unnoticed by the land beneath them. The whisper that morning had been literal and then moral, the breath under stone, the soft voice that asked to be acknowledged. Ezequiel had heard it, and his hearing had led him into the space between being a witness and becoming an actor. There was no trumpeting, only the steady continuation of living. When the hills let their long shadows stretch and the evening made things softer, Nahira stood at the doorway and put her hand on the stone like a benediction without piety. The canyon kept the names. Perhaps in time, it would keep kinder histories too. Ezequiel came out behind her and watched the land hold them as two small creatures of habit and courage living in an old world. If you felt the pull of this story and want to hear more quiet tales like it, consider sharing your thought below. Did he hear the whisper? Tell us what you would have done, and if this voice moved you, subscribe and share so more stories that listen for the small things can reach other ears.